Hello and welcome to our fourth and final session of Here's the Church, Here's the Steeple. We started this whole class looking at sort of generally church architecture and design and what the theology and meaning behind it, and then sort of rudimentary orienting ourselves with the different parts, or what I call the geography of the church. Then we moved to furnishings, and then we moved to vestments, vessels, and actions. And all of this was sort of brought about after we had moved back into our historic church in a desire to understand not only the history of the larger church and what is out there, not just at St. James, but to now apply those things to our church. And that's what today's session is going to be about. And so just as we have done in the last two sessions, we're going to start by indeed orienting ourselves with the geography of St. James. And so in the picture now, you see the narthex. Again, the narthex is that space that sort of serves as the porch. I kind of see it as that threshold between where the world meets the sacred, and that sacred space of the church. And so it sort of serves as that liminal space or the threshold that connects the two. We come in from the world with all that we carry inside us and lay it at the foot of the cross, and then we go back into the world, back into our mission field with the good news that we have heard and we have experienced. And that narthex serves as that in-between transitional space. Then we have the nave. The nave is that part of the church where a majority of the people sit. Again, coming from the word navis, where the word we get for navy. So in other words, it means a ship. Many of the early basilicas were rounded in the roof, like the bottom of a ship, a fishing ship. And reminds us of the many stories of how water sort of symbolizes chaos, and that the boat, whether it be Noah's Ark or Jesus calming the waters, and the many other instances we get. And so the church is that safe space in the midst of the chaotic waters of the world. And so this is the nave. The next thing we have are our transepts, connected, of course, by the crossing, which in our church is very narrow between the steps of the chancel and the start of the nave. But we have the transepts. And the first transept we have is the north transept, which is on the side where the baptismal font is. And this is a good chance to say, or to remind of our directions, which our church actually faces pretty close to true east. But the altar is, whether it's facing true east or not, or on the end of the church that is true east or not, we always call that the eastern side. So it's the liturgical east. Sometimes it's more northeast than true east, but nonetheless, that is the east side. And so this is the north transept. And again, it is pretty much on the north side of the building, and it forms part of one of the arms of the cruciform, or the cross shape that the building maintains. And then there's the south transept. South transept is where the pulpit is located. Now we move to the chancel. The chancel is technically that space from those steps all the way to the back wall, but typically, as I've shared before, in the Episcopal Church, we mean the chancel is that area in which contains the choir, it contains the prayer desks, it contains the pulpit and the lectern. And so it's from the steps up to that altar rail. And more often than not, that's what we typically mean when we say the chancel. And then here is our sanctuary, that space inside the rail. It's that holy of holy spaces. It's where the most holy action of communion and Eucharist takes place, where we gather around the table and offer up our prayers and thanksgiving as we then partake of the Holy Sacrament of communion. And in there, you'll see the altar rail, as I said, the altar itself. You'll see the aumbrey kind of behind the altar, and we'll look at that in more detail shortly. You see the bottom of the sanctuary lamp hanging, and then in the picture, which you don't see, is over on our right from the picture is the Credence Table. And so, anyway, a beautiful, wonderful, wonderful sight. And just such a truly gorgeous place. Now, I wanted to show this picture. This is a picture that was taken, and is, as the caption says, it is the earliest known interior picture. You could kind of make out in the back, maybe it looks like flowers. From what the caption says that was with this picture is that it was most likely taken at Easter in around 1896, 97 or so, which means it would have been 96, excuse me, but maybe 1897. In other words, it's within the first year or two of when we had moved into the church. You can see those wood floors that have now recently been re-exposed. There is a very meager striped carpet running up the middle aisle. The lectern and the pulpit. Pulpit is much more tame and are much more reserved. We do not have the sanctuary lamp, but you'll also see the framing in the windows at the front. We do not have stained glass windows at this moment. And the framing of those windows matches that of what we see in the rest of the building, with a lot of wood rather than a single stained glass window taking up those entire openings. You see the wood paneling, but there are not the carvings yet. You see an opening on the right for an organ, but then you do not see, and then you see the door that would go into what was the rector's office and is now the organ chamber there on the right. You see the door on the left that goes to the sacristy, but you'll notice that it's not cut out for the organ, as that would not be completed in preparing that until we needed larger organs, which we've had several organs over the years. And so it's just a wonderful, wonderful, beautiful space, still even then and still even so today. You'll see that the choir section is much, much smaller. That spacing in the chancel is wide, very wide. And then it's hard to make out, but the altar rail is wooden and not our current altar rail that we have today. So then as we go back to our first session where we talked about different architectural styles of churches, we know that our church is very much, very classically Gothic revival, which was very popular in the 19th century. And as we talked about then, being greatly influenced by the movement in England as Queen Victoria and the church during her reign were building churches like crazy, and many of which were in the Gothic revival. And so when it came time for us to build a church in 1895, it too carried on that Gothic revival. And some of the key architectural features are the bright windows. You might remember we talked about how having lots of tall windows, allowing as much light in as possible. This is an effort to help brighten up the space, especially in a time that was before electric lighting. And so the windows help to serve as a way of letting in as much light as possible, and often using, therefore, stained glass windows that depicted saints or depicted stories from the life of Christ or important symbols, which all of our stained glass windows has a combination of all of what I just mentioned. But the stained glass window helps to diffuse that light. So, for instance, on that east wall, I would imagine if you think back to that picture I just showed of the earliest church, that you will, or the earliest known picture of the church, without a stained glass window, it could probably have been pretty bright, shining through those windows in the early morning. being that it faced due east. And so the stained glass window helps to diffuse that light while it's still brightening up the space. Another is the tall ceilings. You can't walk into the church and not notice those beautiful, wonderful tall ceilings. That, as we had talked about it, the idea is that it helps to draw your eye upward and forward, kind of focusing on the transcendence of God, the all-powerful, mighty, God that is all around us and looking up into the heavens as you walk into the church and see the beautiful craftsmanship of those ceilings. They are mahogany, and which would have been extremely rare back in the late 19th century. And so it's truly craftsmanship that is just would be so hard to replicate to this day. And so another very key feature, along with the arches, as you see those, it's not a true just full arch, but a lot of using of the arch with those support beams and the buttresses and arching up in there, and then using that space as it hangs down with the various pennants and things like that. And so arches is another key thing that you see, whether it's arches in the ceiling, arches in the windows, arches anywhere and everywhere you can kind of get them. Then also another key element of Gothic revival is that it's very ornate. If you look at some of the old original Gothic churches, or even the Gothic revival churches of England, sometimes borderline crossing into the gaudy, with the amount of frescoes and stenciling and gold and mosaics and all the different things that they have. And ours, I don't think crosses that line like some of these others do, but it's very ornate, and had been added to with the use of the stained glass windows, the brass, the candlesticks. Just everything is big and bright and beautiful. And the idea of that, again, is similar to that transcendence reaction that the roof creates. The church itself is meant to evoke a sense of beauty and awe and wonder as we contemplate those things about God, and then about God giving beauty and creation into all that we know and all that we have. And so it is to sort of mirror and reflect that and help us draw into a sort of contemplation of God's greatness and beauty, and God's ability to create, and then to make us co-creators in that. And then, as we've shared, the church is in a cruciform. In other words, it's in a cross form, with the nave all the way up through the chancel, making the main long body of the cross, and then the transepts being the arms of the cross itself, which again is very traditional in Gothic architecture, and therefore Gothic revival architecture. Now, this is not a picture from the 1890s like that first one was, but it's only taken about 10, 15 years, about actually 12 years later. And for a good many years, you'll see that after the windows, the Tiffany windows, were installed, and we're going to talk about those a little bit more very shortly. But when the Tiffany windows were installed, the walls themselves were stenciled. And then you'll see all the extra greenery that was put in around the paneling, as well as then the flowers. This is from an Easter, either right after the windows had been installed, the Tiffany windows up at the front, or the Easter after. But it's certainly early in having the Tiffany windows. And then for a good while, actually, we had that stenciling, which was very much, as I kind of mentioned, a part of that Victorian Gothic revival, and then even into the Edwardian architecture, as we often call it as well. Now we're going to look at some of the furnishings and items that we have within the church itself and kind of talk about the uniqueness and the beauty and the story as best we know it about those things. Here we have our bishop's chair. The bishop's chair, if you actually go back to that last picture we saw, the bishop's chair was in that picture. However, it was covered with leather, and the needlework, all of the needlework, and we're not going to go through all of those here, but you'll see them throughout the pictures. That needlework has all been done by parishioners over the years, and it's just absolutely a true beauty and art, and something that is a key part of the splendor of the building, and each one carrying incredible symbolism, and in many ways even having homages to whether we fully realized it or not, like for instance the flowers in the two chairs that you see here, hearkening in many ways to the garden scene found in the Tiffany windows, and that then the stenciling mirrored or mimicked and played off of as being an extension of the garden scene. But here we have the bishop's chair, and as we've talked about, the bishop's chair is the actual bishop's seat, rather, is at the cathedral, which is in New Orleans, but every church has a bishop's chair. A reminder that we are part of something larger than ourselves, part of that apostolic succession, and you'll see here then that wonderful, beautiful chair that we have with the symbol of Louisiana with the pelican on there, and a pelican became a symbol to the church over time of Christ, because it always appeared as if the pelican mother was piercing itself in order to save and to help its children. It's babies, but you have then the seal of the Diocese of Louisiana there on our bishop's chair, and it like so many things is just such a piece of art and beautiful. One of my favorite stories that we have here at St. James is the Baptismal Font, and with the Baptismal Font. So you see the baptismal, or the Paschal candle rather, there on the far left. However, what we see then is the baptismal font itself. And the story goes like this. You'll see that it says in memoriam to Thomas Williams, who was was part of the infantry artillery unit that was stationed here in Baton Rouge during the Civil War. Specifically, he was the brigadier general in charge of the units here that were stationed. And as they came into to Baton Rouge, they were sent up from New Orleans in 1862, so in the first 2 years of the war. Or a little more than a year after the war had begun, and General Williams brought his regiment, or his regiments of infantry and artillery and whatnot, into Baton Rouge, and they held the city for several months. So they came in sometime in late May, and then the battle itself would take place in early August. So over about that 2 months of June and July, General Williams would come to church at St. James. We don't know for sure how many times he came, but we know he came more than once. He came several times, and he actually was writing letters home and sending them back to his family, not only describing Baton Rouge itself, but very specifically and openly sharing how even though he was a, quote, occupying force, and even though there were all of these differences between them, that when he walked into the church, he was not treated as an other, but rather that St. James exemplified what we now quote from Ephesians, that we are that there is one Lord, one faith, one baptism, one God and Father of all. and that he became a part of the life and membership of, so to speak, of St. James. Of course, he wasn't a member per se, but was warmly welcomed and received. And he shared all this in his letters back home. Well, needless to say, in the battle in early August, he is killed. The members of the church go out to try to find him and retrieve him. He had already died in the field. Apparently, he had been shot early in the battle. And so the members of the congregation prepared his body for burial and had him then sent back to his family rather than just being put in a one of the graves outside of town. They had him sent back to his family so that he could be properly buried with them. And all that is to say that the family was so moved that when several years later, during a conference and gathering that was happening in New Orleans, the sun had come down, and so he got on a riverboat, came up the river, and came to Baton Rouge, and looked at all the things that his father had written about, had the letters with him, and specifically stopped at St. James, shared the letters, and then also talked to many of the parishioners who had known his father. And in fact, there was one woman who, even though it was 20 something years old, she now was in her late 30s, early 40s. And she was actually the one who knelt next to him at communion the Sunday before the battle and received communion next to him. Well, anyway, the son ended up being the Bishop of Michigan, and as a sign of reconciliation and a sign of appreciation for the way in which St. James had modeled Christ's work of reconciliation, and that the way in which St. James had put its mind on the will of God and being united as the people of God, he wanted to donate a baptismal font, and that is the one that we have today as a marker and as a symbol that we are of one Lord, one faith, one baptism. And I love the inscription that most people don't see that's on the back of the font, which is, "I give up my will to the will of God." In other words, we, no matter our differences, no matter our things that tear us apart, we are united in God as one Lord, one faith, one baptism. Now, there's so many just distinctive features, but one of them, of course, are the hand carved wood panelings. And as we shared at the beginning, is those panels were not originally that way. That earliest picture you saw that they were not in place, but by the time we got to that next picture where there's all this garden scene stenciling along the walls, they were in place. And that is due to these two rectors. The one in the middle is Joseph Tucker. That is not a picture of him when he served here. By the time he came here, he was of older age and of declining health. And that was probably actually a picture taken around his ordination that was provided by his family. But what we do know is that because he was in declining of health, he was not as busy doing the works that he was supposed to be doing as a rector, and because he was bedridden most of the time. Rector back then would go and pop into houses each and every day in order to collect their pew rental tithe, because back then it was not pledging, but rather you would rent your pew, and hence where the numbering on the pews come from oftentimes. And that is he was behind in that. And so the church, though, was losing money and was still trying to pay off the debt on the building. He wasn't able to do all those things because he just physically was unable. He was sick and also had a bad back, and it got to the point where he could not ride a horse or ride a bicycle. But so as he sat in his bed, he began carving. and he began whittling. And 33 of the original 36 panels that were carved were done by Joseph Tucker in this time, from about 1899 until his death in 1906. Then, in his death, he had recommended to the vestry that they call his son, who was serving at Grace St. Francisville. And so in comes Lewis Tucker, and Lewis comes in and begins organizing the church in wonderful ways, helping to shore up some of the administrative items that had been neglected, got everything back in order, and began really an age of what today we would kind of call ministry programming, which did not really exist before then. There was a Sunday school starting to bloom and to blossom, but he expanded that, for instance, by starting a boys' youth group that would gather primarily to box. And one of my favorite parts of that story, though, is that while the boys were waiting, he began teaching them how to whittle. And so Lewis Tucker gets the credit for finishing the other 3 panels of the original 36, but he did it in conjunction with the boys from the sort of boxing youth group as they were waiting for their turn to go into the ring. They would sit there and whittle, and so that's how the wood paneling, those original set of wood panelings, were completed, and that is due in large part by the Tuckers. Now, one of the things that was starting to happen in Louisiana in general, but then starting to affect St. James in particular, was the rising of the high church movement that we know as the Oxford and Cambridge movements. And we start to see that shortly after Lewis Tucker departs, and he heads over to the West Coast, the Northwest coast. And what we see is a rising and sort of more formal high church. And that's also when we start to see a lot of the more ornate items that come into the church. And so, for instance, this is right at the end of Tucker, or I should say right after the death of Joseph Tucker and during Lewis Tucker, we get the Tiffany windows. And where this comes from is, first we have to look at Elvira Gehrig. Elvira was an active member who in her life decided she wanted to ensure that the church would not be encumbered by any kind of debt. And so she had paid off the debt from the construction of the church. Then shortly after that, she passed away, predeceasing her as her daughter, Eleanor Cornell, who was married to a William Cornell. And so they had, when the mother and the daughter had both died, William Cornell, Mr. Cornell, decided he wanted to honor them by donating the Tiffany windows. Real quick, the altar rail moved from the wooden also to those brass with the wooden top at the time of Elvira. So Elvira had given those, Elvira Gehrig gave those before her death. Well, when she died, William Cornell donated the Tiffany windows. And so in 1909, he had them commissioned through the Tiffany Glass Company, which does not exist anymore. It was an extension of, the Tiffany out of Tiffany Company out of New York. And he chose specifically a scene that was very unique. In most Episcopal churches, you see images of Christ, you see images of resurrection, and if they're in a more Catholic church, you would see images of the cross and the crucified Christ. But here, St. James, with Mr. Cornell's sort of direction, went with what would be considered by many as kind of a more Eastern Orthodox. And so it was not controversial, but was raised a little eyebrows because it was a scene of the angel in the garden where the tomb was, and that the angel is there heralding the good news that Christ has risen from the dead, that he is not here, and that he will meet them in Galilee. And so the name of the piece actually is Morning and Evening. Now, oftentimes I get comments about, is there any way we can brighten up the window on the right? Well, the window on the right is named Evening. The one on the left is Morning. The one on the right is Evening, with the angel in the middle, declaring the good news of the resurrection. And so it's a dark window. It's a naturally dark window. And that's not to say that the big buildings next to us have not gone on to dampen it, because there's early morning if you're in the church and the sun is aiming just right. It does brighten up quite beautifully. But we have put the largest light we possibly can now on it. And it made a very small difference at night, but not a big one. And so it just, we've done what we can, but there's not a lot more we can, that we can do. We can't mirror, the power of the sun. But anyway, so that's the story of the Tiffany windows. Now, as for the other, the stained glass windows that we have, many of those, start to come in, during the 1930s and 1940s, and specifically things like being donated to those who fought and died in the world wars. We have one of the circular windows, and one of the transepts is donated to the rector before Warline, which was Lockhart. Malcolm Lockhart. And so that's when we start to see the arrival of many of these other wonderful and beautiful stained glass windows that we have throughout, including, the earlier, you saw the picture of St. James himself, who lives in the bell tower there. And so many of these, as I said, start coming in during the 1940s, really more than the 30s. So in the 1940s. And so, for instance, as I said, specifically it is the Palm Sunday window was the one given in memory of those who lost their lives in World War II. And then it's the Alpha and the Omega window that was donated and given in Thanksgiving in memory of the former rector, Malcolm Lockhart. And so anyway, the church begins to take on the look and the feel of what we know it as today in its interior. Now, last few little things. There's the Credence Table, as we have talked about. It's a beautiful, beautiful piece of woodwork and craftsmanship. I don't know how long that itself has been here, but it probably has been a part of the life here for a long time. Here is an up-close look of what the aumbrey behind the altar. Now, this in particular, this shelf was a later addition and was created after the altar was pulled off the wall. We have to remember the altar used to be pushed against the wall. And so when the altar was removed from the wall is when this came in, and these sets of candles were added. From the old pictures, it appears that there was a shelf of some sort that would have had some of these things. And it may have even been this shelf that the altar was just pushed up against this that you see here in that picture. But then the aumbrey was probably then added to the bottom when the altar was pulled off and away from the wall. And then we have the sanctuary lamp, a beautiful, beautiful piece of craftsmanship. That's here, like many of the other brasswork we have. Not pictured in this, for instance, though, is also the incredible lectern with the eagle on it, which we talked about in the Furnishings, of how the eagle is a prominent symbol in Episcopal and Anglican Church of England churches, as a symbol of God's word being able to fly far and wide, and not being able to be stopped by the whims of the world and nature. And so another example of beautiful craftsmanship, and here in particular, our sanctuary lamp. I don't know the full story. I did as much research as I could to try to figure out when we received it, and when we had it down to have it redone. I wish I would have taken more time to read the inscriptions on it and known a little bit more of its story. But it's now up there in the sky and shining beautifully. And so the last thing we have is the stories of the organs. So early in the church, we had a very simple, very simple organ, and very small, and that was what you saw in that original cut space. Then over time, in the 1930s, they added a larger organ, and they cut the second space in order to add more pipes. Then another organ came in the 1950s, and so we started getting organs about every 20 years or so. And so then that organ was a very high-end organ, and still, though, fairly small. At this point, though, they took over what used to be the rector's office and filled completely in that organ chamber that we have today, that's on the pulpit side, or on the south side. And then in 1975, we ordered a slicker organ. That's when they moved the console into the stair across and created that sort of the well, which is now gone, and we've been restored back to its original state of sort of having that symmetry all the way across the steps, and moving the organ console back behind the pews in the chancel, the choir's pews. But it was at that time that we ordered a much larger organ, a very large organ that needed a lot of space. We had originally told them that we were going to build a balcony in which to put and install the organ. However, the organ did not. We did not build the balcony, and when the organ builder showed up to install it, we instead had to cut the space that is up above the sacristy in order to fit the remainder of the pipes. And that's how that space became a space for organ pipes. And that's how we had the organ on both sides of the chancel there. And so today, now, we had that organ from 1975 until its removal in 2020. And so that organ actually was the longest serving organ here at St. James, serving 45 years. And now we have a new goulding in wood. Now, many organs, if they are maintained, and that Schlicker organ that we had before could have lasted longer, but we've got to make sure we keep good air conditioning and keep the humidity down and keep air moving and take good care of it and make sure we're tuning that. And that's the hope and the plan by improving the AC system. And we've added, and you look in the chamber as it's open just for a short period longer until the new organ comes. We have air movers to keep so the air doesn't just grow stale and humid sitting back behind the pipes. And all of these things will go on to help us maintain this new, very custom, very artistic organ. It's going to have new hand-carved woodwork that's going to fill in those openings. The pipes themselves are going to be more muted than the bright gold pipes that we had before, but with an homage to the old stenciling as the pipes have been stenciled. And you can see a picture of the rendering, the artistic rendering here. It's very subtle, but with a little bit of the flower pulling some of the flower look and design from the needlework as well as the old stenciling. And it's going to be, we are very excited. It's going to make our instrument not only a piece of art to listen to, but also with the craftsmanship that goes into the console itself, the craftsmanship that goes into the woodworking that's being added, and the craftsmanship in those what's called the facade pipes, but in other words, the visible pipes. They do play, they are active, but they will help to bring and our worship and tie it all together with beauty and sound. And so that's our tour of the church today, applying just some of these. And of course, we didn't even get to everything that there is, but here we are out of time. And so I want to thank you for participating in our 4-week course of Here's the Church, Here's the Steeple. If you have any questions, please do not hesitate to reach out and let us know. Thank you so much.